So welcome back. We're talking with Kavinya about her work at Equality Now and the role that she had within the Solidarity on African Women's Rights Coalition. And now we're going to talk a little bit about that, the Maputo Protocol, which was a big part of the coalition's efforts. So we had a treaty, it was being domesticated, we've made a lot of progress, we're at 15 years now. But when you started working on these issues, how old was that protocol? How far along was it?
The protocol was 11 years old. 36 countries had ratified, and now we are at 40. So that's progress that has been made. I know it seems like, it's just 4 more countries, but there's a lot that goes into the ratification effort. So we're really proud of the 4 additional countries that have ratified in the time that that has elapsed. Has elapsed. Right. Yeah.
Which were the hardest issues to advocate for? Because I mean, from some of the work that I've seen being done, different countries have different sticking points with these things. But which were the ones that you found the hardest?
Well, it's as you have said, or as you have mentioned, there are different issues when you go to different contexts. And it's based on the contextual realities for each of these states. So I would say one that is universally controversial is the question of access to safe abortion care. You know that the Maputo Protocol is the only women's rights charter, or any charter, I think, anywhere in the world, or a treaty anywhere in the world, that specifically talks about access to abortion as a right. Yeah, and that is very controversial for many states. Yeah,
especially in an African context where we espouse what we work with as pro-life, anti-abortion, ideology.
I think that that pro-life, pro-choice dichotomy in terms of acceptability across the African continent, I think is relative, because definitely, of course, there are people who are very strong proponents of access to safe abortion care services. And this is also part of the conversations that we have around comprehensive access to sexual and reproductive rights for girls and women, but there are also very strong opponents around that. But it is a controversial issue nonetheless, and the issues mostly, I would say, in my experience, that make it quite problematic is religious questions,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're quite religious in Africa.
Yeah, well, we like to be conveniently religious, when it suits us.
When it suits us.
But that is one of the most controversial issues, and I would say that, for example, every time we'd have the ratification missions, for example, with the SOA coalition, then that was a question that would come up in terms of the state. It doesn't mean that if a state would ratify, then they would ratify with reservations, but it would be a discussion to have nonetheless. Yeah. If you move to other contexts, for example, like Sierra Leone, the question of FGM was huge, is still a huge issue in the country, because it's widely practiced. It's also something that is embedded in the political situation in the country, for example, wherein it's one of the countries where you find that FGM is a campaign issue, where sometimes politicians are even wary to really throw their weight behind addressing the question of FGM, because it has political ramifications for them from the voting, from their voting bloc. So it really, I would say, depends on the context that you would go to. And then, of course, another one is a question of child marriage. I remember having conversations in South Sudan where there were questions around the Maputo Protocol, Article 14, which really talks about, you know, the right of a woman to determine how many children she should have, how they should be spaced, and so on and so forth. And some of the concerns that came out were that, look, you know, we're a country coming out of conflict. We already, in terms of population, don't have the numbers. How then can this happen? But then, of course, even some of those conversations really embedded in, you can see, you know, patriarchy, you know, where people are like, how can a girl or a woman have autonomy over her body in that way?
Yeah, because the society, the culture is that the man decides.
Yeah.
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 And we saw that also with female genital mutilation, FGM, where, you know, in this context, I think a lot of people identify women's circumcision as you know, FGM, but it's not just the only kind of female genital mutilation, right? But men, you find sometimes are the ones who you know, wielded the power in many cases within that society to decide. So they're deciding on whether you experience this you know, brutal practice, and then they're also deciding whether you have a child or how many children you have, and that's a kind of patriarchy you know, we're talking about, right?
Yeah, of course, there's an element, I think we need to nuance it a little bit, because of course then there are different custodians of tradition or culture. It could well be, as you're saying, men who make decisions within society, but you could also find that they are custodians of certain customs in that society who are women. Yeah, and they're the ones that also play a huge role in terms of perpetuating the practice, you know, and this is very common in West Africa, for example, where you have entire institutions, for example, in the Mano River countries, that are actually run by women, you know, have women, and they're the ones who continue to practice this and pass it on from generation to generation. So, you know, custodians of culture and tradition is not necessarily just men. They may also be women who are involved, and there are different reasons why they're involved. It's because they are socialized in a certain way, and they internalize that this is the way things should be done. And that's why it's very important to have conversations, because also, as you know, culture evolves. Yeah, it does. Right? Culture evolves. Where, you know, there are things that we need to discuss in terms of why certain practices constitute human rights violations, and why we need to change that. Yeah. And so one of the things that I would also say the Maputo Protocol recognizes in Article 2 is that laws and policies are not enough. Yeah? Yeah. You need to have conscious discussions with your citizenry so that they can understand what human rights are, why we are fighting for this women's rights, so that there is a change as to the mindset, because a law cannot change how you think. Yeah, that's true. A policy cannot change how you think, but if we continue to have good laws, good policies, but couple that with conversations at different levels, then we continue to progressively change the situation when it comes to girls' and women's rights violations, or even acceptability of certain girls' and women's rights. Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. We've come a long way as a continent. We have a very progressive legal instrument that African countries are domesticating. But when we come back, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the progress we've made. So we're going to talk about that and which countries have made progress in our view. So we'll be back.